Hello, my friends. Today we begin our review of Century of Self. This is a four-part documentary. Well, we're going to do this in four parts because it's about 4 hours, so, but roughly an hour per piece. And in these current times and with the remote delivery aspect, I can't watch this with you, obviously, but I think this is kind of the next coolest thing, and I'm going to try to do this in a way that, I'll try to add points and stuff throughout to try to add some context in how it applies to some of the things we've been learning and how some of the people and theories that we've been learning about kind of extend outside of what's traditionally kind of covered in a psychology class. And with this idea of century of self, think of that in relation to this idea like psychology has really only been around. Well, this is really the story of Freud and the offshoots of Freud. All right, so we're talking like last 120 years, last 130 years. Let's get into this. I think you're gonna love this. It's controversial and it's got some scenes that are tough to see, especially when it makes references to things related to World War II and Nazi Germany, but it's all part of the story. That's part of the motivating force that brought Freud to America is getting away from that. So it's part of this interlocking essence of this story of this century of self. Okay, I don't know if that was a decent intro, but let's get into this. So I'm trying this in a different kind of software, but I think this will be better for the viewer.
He hated it. Said he wanted this stuff.
100 years ago, a new theory about human nature was put forward by Sigmund Freud. He had discovered, he said, primitive sexual and aggressive forces hidden deep inside the minds of all human beings. Forces which, if not controlled, led individuals and societies to chaos and destruction. This series is about how those in power have used Freud's theories to try and control the dangerous crowd in an age of mass democracy.
The footage in this is
At the heart of the story is
really
not just Sigmund Freud, but other members of the Freud family. This episode is about Freud's American nephew, Edward Bernays. Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and use them to manipulate the masses. He showed American corporations for
Did you catch that? Take Freud's ideas about the unconscious and use it to manipulate the masses.
the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. Out of this would come a new political idea of how to control the masses. By satisfying people's inner selfish desires, one made them happy and thus docile. It was the start of the all-consuming self, which has come to dominate our world today.
I'm going to try to just because I can just change the banner, these are called, where I put happiness machine. I'll try to do that with any keywords or something that I thought that you might be wanting to jot down or whatever.
Freud's ideas about how the human mind works have now become an accepted part of society, as have psychoanalysts. Every year, the psychotherapist's ball is held in a grand palace in Vienna.
This is
Check out this psychotherapist
some advanced
waltz
patients come, or
ball.
former patients come, and many other people, friends, but also people from the Viennese society who like to go to a nice, elegant, comfortable ball.
But it was not always so. 100 years ago, Freud's ideas were hated by Viennese society. At that time, Vienna was the centre of a vast empire ruling Central Europe. And to the powerful nobility of the Habsburg court, Freud's ideas were not only embarrassing, but the very idea of examining and analysing one's inner feelings was a threat to their absolute control.
You see, at that time, these people had the power. And of course, you just were not allowed to show your bloody feelings. I mean, you just couldn't. You know, I mean, you couldn't, if you were unhappy, can you imagine? You, for instance, you sit somewhere in the country in a castle, you are deeply unhappy, you are a woman. You couldn't go to your maid and cry on her shoulders, or you couldn't go into the village and complain, you know, about your feelings. I mean, you couldn't, it was like selling yourself to somebody. You just couldn't, you know? Because they had to respect you. Now, of course, Freud, you see, put that thought very much into question, because you see, to examine yourself, you would have to put a lot of other things into question. Your society, everything what surrounds you. And that wasn't a good thing at that time.
Why not?
Because your self-created empire, to a certain extent, would have fallen into bits much earlier already.
But what frightened the rulers of the empire even more was Freud's idea that hidden inside all human beings were dangerous instinctual drives. Freud had devised a method he called psychoanalysis. By analysing dreams and free association, he had unearthed, he said, powerful sexual and aggressive forces, which were the remnants of our animal past. Feelings we repressed because they were too dangerous.
Not to make light of what the point he's making, but awesome to just see the footage of Freud laying back on a reclining lawn chair with a cushion, just reading. It's a pretty classic little piece of like stock footage.
Freud devised a method for exploring a hidden part of the mind, which we nowadays call the unconscious, which is a part that is totally unknown to our consciousness, that there exists a barrier in all our minds which prevents these hidden and unwelcome impulses of the unconscious from emerging. Good night.
Good night.
In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire led Europe into war. As the horror mounted, Freud saw it as terrible evidence of the truth of his findings. The saddest thing, he wrote, is that this is exactly the way we should have expected people to behave, from our knowledge of psychoanalysis. Governments had unleashed the primitive forces in human beings, and no one seemed to know how to stop them. At that time, Freud's young nephew, Edward...
Okay, the story about this. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. I promise you I'll never sing. But just think about that. If you've ever heard that, I know nothing about opera. My knowledge of opera is almost non-existent. But I feel like I've heard that dun, dun, that melody, right? The greatest voice the world's ever known. This is going to be about how this nephew of Freud becomes this like master of public relations propaganda, basically of how to, well, is going to become public relations, but originally it's called propaganda. But basically how to spin things, how to be a spin doctor.
Bernays was working as a press agent in America. His main client was the world-famous opera singer Caruso, who was touring the United States. Bernays' parents had emigrated to America 20 years before, but he kept in touch with his uncle and joined him for holidays in the Alps. But Bernays was now about to return to Europe for a very different reason. On the night that Caruso opened in Toledo, Ohio, America announced it was entering the war against Germany and Austria. As a part of the war effort, the US government set up a Committee on Public Information, and Bernays was employed to promote America's war aims in the press. The President, Woodrow Wilson, had announced that the United States would fight not to restore the old empires, but to bring democracy to all of Europe. Bernays proved extremely skillful in promoting this idea both at home and abroad. And at the end of the war, he was asked to accompany the president to the Paris Peace Conference.
Then, to my surprise, they asked me to go over with Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference. And at the age of 26, I was in Paris for the entire time of the peace conference that was held in the suburb of Paris, and we worked to make the world safe for democracy. That was a big slogan.
Make the world safe.
Wilson's reception in Paris astounded Bernays and the other American propagandists. Their propaganda had portrayed Wilson as a liberator of the people, a man who would create a new world in which the individual would be free. They had made him a hero of the masses. And as he watched the crowd surge around Wilson, Bernays began to wonder whether it would be possible to do the same type of mass persuasion, but in peacetime.
When I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
Bernays returned to New York and set up as a public relations counsel in a small office.
Did you see that switch? Right? Propaganda, public relations. Same people, same job, same department, same desk, same pen and paper, just it's a different job title.
This off Broadway. It was the first time the term had ever been used. Since the end of the 19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund.
So these documentaries are kind of neat because it's this interesting combination of like this classic old footage and then this Adam Curtis guy that's like narrates it and then cuts it and all this stuff. So I hope you enjoy this.
While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his general introduction to psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him. He wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious.
What Eddie got from Freud was indeed this idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision-making, not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior. And so Eddie began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course. And Eddie knew that was not the way the world worked.
Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients...
So some of you might not like this part because he's going to make the reference to Freud's idea of penis envy and link it to smoking. So, but I want you to at least, and if you want to hear a really good critique of that Freudian concept, Karen Horney, who was a Freudian but critical of this specific idea, is someone you should look into. Yeah, but again, with Freud, be slow to dismiss.
George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it.
He said, we're losing half of our market because men have invoked a taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that? I said, let me think about it. And then I said, have I your permission to see a psychoanalyst to find out what cigarettes mean to women? He said, what'll it cost? So I called up Dr. Brill, A.A. Brill, who is a leading psychoanalyst.
So think about this, right? So they're trying to say, okay, we're selling cigarettes, but we're noticing that, like, just viewing women as from the cigarette company perspective as a potential market share, we're missing this huge group of people. How do we make it acceptable for them to do it? And he's saying, well, let's take like a psychoanalytic approach and let's speak to these, what I just put on the screen there, these hidden irrational forces in people, and specifically targeted at this one market population that's not currently consuming our product. And you can see with Bernays, like smoking, this is just one example. He's going to do this in a lot of different ways. This is applied Freudian ideas, right? But it's not Freud. Well, it is Freudian concepts applied in kind of marketing, what is later going to be this field of public relations.
In New York at that time.
How come you didn't call your uncle? Why didn't you call your uncle?
Because he was in Vienna.
A.A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America. And for a large fee, he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises. Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came.
You don't have to like that idea.
Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes.
Okay, now think about this though. So what he's saying is, okay, so regardless of sort of the kind of the conceptual framework, if you're looking at this as like a public relations manipulative stunt, what he's trying to do is let's have a big attention event, this huge parade, and then let's get all these women that look cool to do this same thing kind of at the same time, and have a bunch of people see it and normalize it, right? 'Cause remember, he's trying to think of what public relations is. There's the thing, there's you, and it's trying to be something in the middle of that, shaping how you see the thing.
Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
Torches
He knew
of
this
freedom.
would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase, which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public, with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch, you see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
What Bernays had created was the idea that if a woman smoked, it made her more powerful and independent. An idea that still persists today.
Embrace me, my sweet
It made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to behave irrationally if you link products to their emotional desires and feelings. The idea that smoking actually made women freer was completely irrational, but it made them feel more independent. It meant that irrelevant objects could become powerful emotional symbols of how you wanted to be seen by others.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
Yeah, like sell the good night's sleep, not the mattress, is one of his sayings.
What Bernays was doing fascinated America's corporations. They had come out of the war rich and powerful, but they had a growing worry. The system of mass production had flourished during the war, and now millions of goods were pouring off production lines. What they were frightened of was the danger of overproduction, that there would come a point when people had enough goods and would simply stop buying. Up until that point, the majority of products were still sold to the masses on the basis of need. While the rich had long been used to luxury goods, for the millions of working-class Americans, most products were still advertised as necessities. Goods like shoes, stockings, even cars were promoted in functional terms for their durability. The aim of the advertisements was simply to show people the product's practical virtues, nothing more. What the corporations realized they had to do was transform the way the majority of Americans thought about products. One leading Wall Street banker, Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers, was clear about what was necessary. We must shift America, he wrote, from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs.
Prior to that time, there was no American consumer. There was the American worker, and there was the American owner, and they manufactured and they saved and they ate what they had to, and the people shopped for what they needed. And while the very rich may have bought things they didn't need, most people did not. And Mazur envisioned a break with that, where you would have things that you didn't actually need,
idea, right?
but you wanted, as opposed to needed.
And the man who would be at the center of changing that mentality for the corporations was Edward Bernays.
Bernays really is the guy within the
Like
United
this guy,
States more
Stuart
than anybody else who sort of brings to the table psychological theory as something that is an essential part of how, from the corporate side, of how we are going to appeal to the masses effectively. And the whole sort of merchandising establishment and sales establishment is ready for Sigmund Freud. I mean, they are ready for understanding what motivates the human mind. And so that there's this real openness to Bernays' techniques being used to sell products to the masses.
Beginning in the early 20s, the New York banks funded the creation of chains of department stores across America. They were to be the outlets for the mass-produced goods, and Bernays' job was to produce the new type of customer. Bernays began to create many of the techniques of mass consumer persuasion that we now live with. He was employed by William Randolph Hearst to promote his new women's magazines, and Bernays glamorized them by placing articles and advertisements that linked products made by others of his clients to famous film stars like Clara Bow, who was also his client.
Great celebrity
Bernays
advertisers.
also began the practice of product placement in the movies.
Product placement.
He dressed the stars at the film's premieres.
Just think of that that we think that's so like just commonplace today, right? Bernays had that idea of like, well, why don't you get somebody that people already think is super cool, right? Get people already really like The Rock, get him holding your product, and then and I think The Rock's cool too, but the positive association you have with The Rock then gets transferred to the product, The Rock, the actor, The Rock, right? Or like any celebrity. So it's like and then this second idea of product placement, I'm like talking to you about something, and I don't have something with me right now. I'm like, oh, and then I'll write that down with my incredible new Bic fountain pen. And it's like that kind of idea is product placement. You probably already knew what that concept meant, but that those both link back to him, that's pretty cool.
With clothes and jewellery from other firms he represented. He was, he claimed, the first person to tell car companies they could sell cars as symbols of male sexuality. He employed psychologists to issue reports that said products were good for you and then pretended they were independent studies. He organised fashion shows in the department stores and paid
that so he would get researchers to put out work and then claim that it was independent, but it would be supporting whatever he was
celebrities to repeat the new and essential message. You bought things not just for need, but to express your inner sense of yourself to others.
There's a psychology of dress. Have you ever thought about it? How it can express your character? You all have interesting characters, but some of them are all hidden. I wonder why you all want to dress always the same, with the same hats and the same coats. I'm sure all of you are interesting and have wonderful things about you, but looking at you in the street, you all look so much the same. And that's why I'm talking to you about the psychology of dress. Try and express yourselves better in your dress. Bring out certain things that you think are hidden. I wonder if you've thought of this angle of your personality.
I'd like to ask you some questions. Why do you like short skirts?
Oh, because there's more to see.
More to see, eh? What good does that do you?
Makes you more handsome. It makes you more attractive.
This seems awkward. But
in 1927, an American journalist wrote, "A change has come over our democracy. It is called consumptionism. The American citizen's first importance to his country is now no longer that of citizen, but that of consumer." The growing wave of consumerism helped in turn to create a stock market boom. And yet again, Edward Bernays became involved, promoting the novel idea that ordinary people should buy shares.
Notice how that word isn't consumerism, right? It's related. But consumptionism, it's a different
money from
angle
banks
at it.
he also represented. And yet again, millions followed his advice.
He was uniquely knowledgeable about how people in large numbers are going to react to products and ideas and so on. But in political terms, if he were to go out, so I can't imagine that he could get 3 people to stand and listen. Wasn't particularly articulate, was a kind of funny looking, and didn't have any sense of reaching out for people one-on-one. None at all. He didn't think about people in groups of one, thought about people in groups of thousands.
So I would have nothing to do with it. Hello?
Bernays soon became famous as the man who understood the mind of the crowd. And in 1924, the president contacted him. President Coolidge was a quiet, taciturn man and had become a national joke. The press portrayed him as a dull, humorless figure. Bernays' solution was to do exactly the same as he had done with products. He persuaded 34 famous film stars to visit the White House. And for the first time, politics became involved with public relations.
And I lined up.
So what I want you to notice here, right, is that the same kind of general underlying Freudian idea of, I erased it, but before I had like hidden irrational motives or whatever, it's like that same idea. It's like, okay, how does that apply to selling this type of product or getting this subgroup of the population to do this type of behavior or to rebuild the name of a politician? So that's kind of the turn this is taken now. So we're about halfway through this episode. It's first segment.
People, and I'd say, "What's your name?" He'd say, "Al Jolson." I'd say, "Mr. President, Al Jolson." Next day, every newspaper in the United States had a front page story. President Coolidge entertains actors at White House. And the Times had a headline which said, "President nearly laughed." And everybody was happy.
But while Bernays became rich and powerful in America, in Vienna his uncle was facing disaster.
Oh yeah.
Like much of Europe, Vienna was suffering an economic crisis and massive inflation, which wiped out all of Freud's savings. Facing bankruptcy, he wrote to his nephew for help. Bernays responded by arranging for Freud's works to be published for the first time in America, and began to send his uncle precious dollars, which Freud kept secretly in a foreign bank account.
Okay, I'm gonna pause it here. I think I might actually do these in like, there's 4 of them. Instead of doing them in like hour segments, I might do them in 2 A, B. So basically 8 segments. But yeah, I think that's about a half hour. That's probably a pretty nice bite-sized video. So I hope you've enjoyed it so far. Now we're going to talk about how Freud's about to directly link into this, right? Because Bernays is his nephew. I forget how it works. It's Freud's sister's kid. Okay, so part 2. We're going to get into part 2's, or part whatever it's going to be. I was originally saying it was going to be 4 parts. Let's maybe do it in 8 parts, or maybe because I think it'll just be a little bit nicer, more bite-sized, and then I can add some commentary at the beginning and ending. This is just kind of my first time doing it this way and saving it this way, and I also want to just test and make sure this like worked good and stuff, and is decent quality and all that kind of stuff. So anyways, catch you in the next one, and have a good night, day, whatever.